September 1944. The Italian mountains near the Gothic Line. A small Allied unit is ordered forward with no maps. They are told to find the road and hold it. No one expects the terrain to be the enemy. 2.By 1944, Italy had become a grim proving ground for Allied forces. The initial landings in 1943 had brought swift optimism, but the reality of Italian warfare soon shattered it. The Axis defense was not a single line but a layered maze of mountains, rivers, and fortified villages. Each ridge was a new obstacle. Each valley hid an ambush. The Allied command called it a campaign of attrition, but for the men on the ground it was simply survival. The Gothic Line, a series of German defensive positions stretching across the Apennines, became the final shield protecting northern Italy. The Germans had spent months turning the mountains into a fortress. They used natural terrain as a weapon. They built bunkers into cliffs. They mined the roads. They turned every village into a potential death trap. The Allied advance slowed, and frustration grew among commanders. The front moved at the speed of artillery, not at the speed of soldiers. In September 1944, a British infantry battalion was ordered to advance through a narrow mountain pass near the village of Corniolo. Intelligence was limited. The unit's officers were told the road ahead was intact and lightly defended. They were given one map, crude and outdated. It showed a few main routes, but no detail of the side paths, the ravines, or the smaller passes that could be used for flanking. Yet the battalion was expected to push forward, seize the ridge, and hold it until reinforcements arrived. What made the mission unusual was not the danger. Every operation in Italy carried danger. It was the lack of information. The soldiers were told the road was passable, and they were told to move quickly. They were told that their route was the only way forward. But there was no backup plan. There was no map for the real terrain. The officers knew it, but they had no choice. The higher command was pushing for progress. The front needed momentum. The battalion was to become a spearhead, even if the tip was blind. The men left camp at dawn. The air was cold and thin in the mountains. The landscape looked calm, almost peaceful, but the silence carried a warning. The soldiers marched with their packs heavy and their faces tense. The local civilians watched from their windows, weary and exhausted. Italy had already been torn apart by war, and the civilians had learned to fear any new arrival, even if it was meant to be liberation. The battalion moved through narrow paths and broken stone walls. The terrain was unfamiliar and confusing. The map they carried was not enough. It was missing the details that mattered. The officers realized their mission was not simply to advance. It was to navigate an unknown landscape under enemy pressure. The men were not just soldiers. They were explorers in a battlefield where every step could be their last. As the battalion advanced, the mountain paths began to twist and split. The map's few lines became useless. The soldiers relied on compass bearings and instinct. The officers attempted to coordinate the unit, but the terrain created natural separation. The battalion stretched into smaller groups. The men could not see each other. The silence grew heavier, interrupted only by distant artillery. The first signs of trouble appeared near a narrow gorge. The road ahead was blocked by fallen rocks and debris. The soldiers attempted to clear it, but the rocks were too heavy and the slope too steep. The battalion was forced to detour through a thin path that wound along the edge of the cliff. It was not on their map. The officers did not know where it led. Still, the order remained, advance. It was in this moment that the soldiers began to understand the true nature of their mission. The enemy was not only the German defenders but also the land itself. The mountains could trap them. The paths could disappear. The fog could hide enemy positions. Without maps, the battalion was vulnerable to confusion, separation, and ambush. At midday, the first German defenders appeared. They were not in full strength, but they were well prepared. They had observed the battalion's movement and chose their positions carefully. The Germans used the terrain like a weapon, striking from higher ground. Machine gun fire erupted from hidden bunkers. Mortars followed. The soldiers had no clear way to respond. The battalion's formation broke apart as men scattered for cover. The officers tried to regain control. They attempted to organize a defensive line. But the terrain did not allow it. The soldiers were forced into narrow gaps where movement was limited. The Germans exploited this. The battalion was pushed into a series of small pockets, each isolated from the others. Communication failed. Radio signals were weak. The map could not guide them because it did not show the hidden paths or the enemy's positions. The decision was made to press forward anyway. The commanders believed the mission's objective was still achievable. They thought the Germans were only a small obstacle. They believed that the battalion could reach the ridge and hold it until reinforcements arrived. They did not realize the terrain had already sealed their fate. The soldiers moved in smaller groups, each trying to find a route. Some climbed the rocky slopes. Others followed a narrow stream. The fog thickened. The sound of artillery grew louder. The battalion's progress slowed to a crawl. Every step forward felt like stepping into a trap. By evening, the battalion was scattered across the mountains. Some groups had found temporary shelter. Others were still moving, unsure of where they were. The officers tried to gather their men, but the landscape made it impossible. The battalion was no longer a single unit. It was fragments. And yet the orders remained unchanged. The battalion was expected to reach the ridge by dawn. The night was the worst enemy. The fog became thicker. The air turned colder. The soldiers could barely see their own hands. The battalion was split into separate groups, each isolated from the others. They had no map, no clear path, and no idea where the enemy was waiting. At dawn, the Germans launched a coordinated counterattack. They had spent the night watching the scattered Allied groups. They moved quickly through the hidden paths and ambush points. The first group of soldiers was hit while crossing a narrow bridge. Machine guns opened fire from both sides. The men had nowhere to run. The bridge was the only path forward and the only path back. It became a death trap. The second group was forced into a rocky ravine. They were pinned down by sniper fire. They could not climb the steep walls. They could not retreat. The Germans surrounded them slowly, cutting off escape routes. The soldiers fought, but the terrain worked against them. Every attempt to move was met with enemy fire. The ravine became a cage. A third group reached a small village, hoping to find shelter and a way to regroup. The village was empty. The buildings were destroyed. The roads were blocked. The men realized they were not just lost, they were trapped. The village offered no escape. It only offered a moment of silence before the next attack. The officers attempted to coordinate a final push. They tried to gather the scattered men and advance toward the ridge. But the battalion was no longer a battalion. It was a collection of exhausted soldiers, many wounded, many without supplies. The map remained useless. The terrain was still unknown. The Germans continued to strike from hidden positions. The casualties mounted. Men fell silently in the fog. Others were captured. Some disappeared into the mountains, never to be seen again. The battalion's strength was destroyed not by a single battle, but by a series of small traps. The land itself became the enemy. By midday, the battalion's commander made the hardest decision. The mission was impossible. The objective could not be reached. The ridge was not achievable without reinforcements, and reinforcements could not reach them without a clear path. The commander ordered the remaining men to withdraw. They were to escape the mountains the same way they had entered, without a map. The withdrawal was chaotic. The soldiers moved in silence, avoiding the main paths. They traveled at night, using only the stars and their instincts. Some groups never returned. Some never found their way back. The battalion was reduced to a fraction of its original strength. The men who survived carried the memory of the mountains like a scar. They had been sent forward without maps, without proper intelligence, and without a chance to survive. The mission was forgotten by the higher command. The soldiers were left with the truth: the land had been the final battlefield. The battalion vanished into the mountains. They were sent forward without maps. They walked through fog and rock. They walked as if the land itself was guiding them. The land guided them into traps. The enemy was not only German soldiers. The enemy was the terrain. The mountains hid every path. The maps were useless. The commanders did not know. They still ordered forward. Men became separated. Groups lost each other in silence. Some fell in narrow ravines. Some died on bridges. Some were captured in villages. Some simply disappeared. The fog swallowed them. The survivors kept moving. They moved at night. They moved without direction. They moved with fear. They moved with hunger. They moved with no certainty of return. The ridge was never taken. The mission failed quietly. No one recorded the failure. No one spoke about it again. The higher command moved on. The war continued elsewhere. The men returned in small numbers. They returned with empty stories. They returned with missing friends. They returned with the same silence. They returned with the weight of a forgotten mission. The mountains remained. The paths remained. The maps stayed blank. No memorial was built. No record was kept. No names were spoken. Time erased them. Their footprints faded. Their letters were lost. Their faces disappeared from history. Only the silence remained. The war moved on. The mountains did not change. The fog returned each morning. The land kept its secret. The soldiers were forgotten. No way back. Thank you for watching. New historical stories are published regularly.